Good morning, everyone. My name's Lucia Kutsakraya, and I'm the Marketing Executive for EQS Group in the UK, where we provide a range of digital compliance solutions for all company sizes. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on modern slavery and supply chain compliance developments and the practical implications this can have on whistleblowing. I'm very pleased to be joined by two expert speakers from Caudry Compliance, Andre Bywater and Jonathan Armstrong, who will shortly give a small introduction to themselves before we kick off this webinar. So we've got a lot to cover in the next hour, but we've allowed time at the end for some of your questions. So please feel free to put these in the Q&A module, which you should see highlighted on your side of the console now. These can be entered at any time throughout the webinar, and we've left a good chunk at the end to go through any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Andre and Jonathan to do a brief introduction. Andre, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting us to do this webinar, which we're very much looking forward to. Modern slavery is a real hot topic for us, something at Caudry Compliance we've been dealing with for a number of years now. My name is Andre Bywater, as you said, and I'm a lawyer with the law firm Caudry Compliance, where we deal with a number of compliance issues. But as I say, modern slavery has been a big one for us, and we've been in there since the beginning from the UK perspective. Jonathan.
Thanks, Andre, and I'm too looking forward to joining you all. Thanks all for joining. It's obviously a topic that's of real interest. I'm, like Andre, at Caudry, a technology lawyer, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the emerging threats and the way in which the situation might change as well. So back to you, Andre.
Thank you.
Thanks. So thank you both for that introduction. That was great. I think, Andre, we'll start with you for the first question, and that will be, what have the recent UK developments been, notably about the attempts to reform the UK Modern Slavery Act?
Okay, thank you. That's a great place to start, I think. Modern slavery, supply chain due diligence is on the rise everywhere, and that's very much sort of our theme today. Obviously, we're going to look a bit at the UK aspects. But it's something that's here to stay. So it was a bit of a new kid on the block a few years ago, but it's grown and grown. And when I get to talk a little bit later about the EU's proposal, that is something that is potentially vast. I mean, something that we are calling, if you like, the sort of GDPR equivalent in modern slavery compliance and other areas too. And I think that whistleblowing and modern slavery go very well together. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think of other compliance areas like antitrust, competition law, or bribery and anti-bribery and corruption, there's a little bit of conceptual thinking in some of those areas. But I think something like modern slavery is something that's very tangible. It's very spottable. Yes, spottable is a word. I did check in the dictionary yesterday. Anyone is basically capable of spotting it, and it's something that can affect anyone in the business. It's not just for people who are in the procurement teams, although they are particularly for sort of important people in terms of looking at the supply chain and so on, and seeing whether there's any modern slavery going on. But as I say, it's something that everyone in a business, everyone in an organization can deal with to some degree, as I say, in the sense that they can spot it. And that the sort of immediate reaction, if you like, is, oh, I see there's something wrong going on there, so I'm going to report it. Usually you'd be doing that internally through your whistleblowing channel. And very sadly, as all of you who are on this webinar probably are aware, modern slavery is sadly a huge thing in the world today. And it's not only going on in our supply chains, it's going on under our noses. Classic examples are sort of nail bars, construction sites, car washes, farm fields, and so on. So very sadly, it's all around us. And as I say, at the very end, we're going to talk a little bit about how you actually spot some of the signs of modern slavery so that we've got a sort of practical note to bounce on from when we go into the questions. Now, as from the UK perspective, as your question was, what's going on? Well, just very, very briefly for everybody, in case you're unaware, we've had this modern slavery legislation since 2015 in the UK, and there's a disclosure and transparency element to that, where if you're an organisation with an annual turnover of more than £36 million, which is about 42 million euros or 44 million US dollars, you are required to publish once a year on your website a statement where you talk about what you've done to say that you're trying to ensure that there's no slavery or human trafficking going on in your business or your supply chain. Now, you're not promising that you have eradicated modern slavery. That will be perhaps too high a bar. All you're saying is, we've done all we can. These are the things that we've done to try and ensure that there is no slavery. I say it's a UK Act, but it has extraterritorial application. So if you're a business or a multi-organizational company, you're outside the UK, but you're selling goods or services into the UK, and you meet those thresholds, the Act does catch you as well. So it's not just a sort of something that's unique for UK companies. And when you publish that statement, you have to cover 6 recommended areas. They're voluntary. And one of them that you have to talk about is your policies in relation to slavery and human trafficking. And I think that's where most immediately something like whistleblowing fits in. Because you'll be saying there, we have a whistleblowing hotline, we had so many calls, and so on and so on. And then the other one of those 6 areas where whistleblowing, I think, does fit in as well, although we see that we don't see a lot of this, is you're supposed to talk about how effective what you've been doing to combat modern slavery and human trafficking in the supply chain of your own business has been. So basically, it's asking you to do KPIs. And for example, you could say, like, in fact, in the example I just gave, we had only, so many calls, so many people spoke up about this last year, or we did so much training about whistleblowing or whatever. So it does get in there. As I say, it's not sort of prescriptive in the UK Act, but just generally we find the organisations we've been dealing with, they will almost invariably have a hotline, a whistleblowing hotline, that's used for modern slavery purposes. Now, getting back to the very beginning of your question, which was, what are the changes that are happening? Well, we've seen many attempts in the UK to try and reform our modern slavery law, including this compliance aspect, particularly because it's been very criticised for having no real teeth. And this year, in May, in the Queen's speech, it was announced that there will be a modern slavery bill that will increase the accountability of companies, and it'll look at various things, like it will make those 6 areas I talked about that were voluntary mandatory. We have no details. They're also talking about making a registry that we have mandatory, and including civil penalties as well for, as I say, giving it a bit of teeth for people who don't comply. So we've only got a general picture, but it'll be interesting to see what the details are. We've had many sort of what we call backbench MPs try and introduce private members' bills where they add things to the Modern Slavery Act. It'll be interesting to see whether they try and bring back some of those things. And I will be curious to see whether, from the whistleblowing perspective, for example, in this area where they're making things mandatory, whether they actually now start to detail things like saying, and you must have a whistleblowing system, a hotline, or so on. I mean, I'm speculating a little bit, but it could happen. I understand there are people who are sort of keen on that, and we're certainly going to probably see cross-party support in the UK Parliament for this bill. I'd say the really tricky one will be, what kind of penalties will there be? What kind of liability might there be? Because I say at the moment it's been criticised for not having any teeth. So let's see. I'm sure it will happen, no matter what the current turmoil is with our current government. So that's where we are now. And I say I'll try and integrate some of those themes also when I come back in a bit to talking about the real whopper, the EU proposal. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that answer. That was really detailed and really informative. So thank you for that. So Jonathan, I'll hand over to you with a question, and that is, what can you tell us about the UK Parliamentary Inquiry relating to Xinjiang? I think I got that right. Supply chains. If you could answer that for us.
Yeah, thank you, Lucia. And obviously, I prepared my remarks on Monday about the government plans, and there they are, because I think that's what they're worth in light of the events of the last 24 hours. But I have got some insight that I could maybe share with you that's absolutely bang up to the minute. And as we said, I'm just checking my phone to see if I've got any updates. But to look at the bit that's fact first, the there was a UK parliamentary inquiry into Xinjiang that reported 17th of March last year, and it made a number of recommendations, some of which were the government committed to putting in place as soon as parliamentary time allows, was the phrase that they used. And as Andre said, that included hardening the current UK legislation, looking at sanctions, which did happen, reviewing export controls. So many of you will be familiar with the way in which the US particularly has used export control regulations to cut down the importation of goods from Xinjiang, or with Xinjiang elements to them, and making the voluntary register compulsory. We also saw in March last year a really strange exercise that the UK government undertook, writing to subsidiaries, particularly of multinational businesses, asking them why they hadn't filed on the register, even though that's voluntary, not compulsory. But the letter sort of indicated that it was a legal requirement, which it wasn't. And one of the other significant aspects, I think, to come out of that parliamentary inquiry was using the weighting mechanism for public procurement to try and steer organisations to look at policies and procedures to deal with modern slavery, which of course will include whistleblowing. Now, everybody understands that it's unrealistic to expect a slave in Zhuar in China to use a whistleblowing helpline when they don't have access to any technology. But as Andre said, the blight of slavery is here at home and abroad, and it's relatively easy to spot signs of slavery with the security guards on our front door or the cleaners that come round our offices. And this procurement weighting, I think, has had a significant effect. And it's one of those places, of course, where compliance teams can add value to an organization. If you can demonstrate that your compliance with modern slavery laws is up to scratch, then you can get up to an additional 10% in the UK government weighting mechanism, which might mean that you win orders over your competitors. We've seen a concentration in some areas, transport, for example, looking at maquette, it's called, so the cloth that is on trains, uniforms for bus conductors, train guards, etc. And just this week, for example, a group of 67 MPs petitioned government to use this weighting mechanism to prohibit two Chinese-based organizations from being involved in CCTV and surveillance camera contracts across government. And this is significant because these two suppliers have 73% market share in UK councils, 60% market share in UK hospitals, 57% market share in schools. So if the government does as it has promised and uses smart procurement, then there are real opportunities, I think, for businesses to increase the bottom line. And of course, that's somewhat UK-centric, but there are similar thoughts going on amongst politicians in many of the countries where we've got guests joining us. And to get really bang up to date, as I've said, the efforts to look at modern slavery and the updating of that have cross-party consensus. The Johnson government committed to making changes as soon as parliamentary time allows. You might question what on earth he was doing with the parliamentary time he had. The days for saying that are over. But why is this relevant to this morning's developments? Well, my understanding is that one of the people who is likely to put their hat in the ring for Prime Minister, has said that China is on their action plan and looking particularly at the plight of modern slavery relating to Xinjiang. One of the people who's likely to be a kingmaker in the election has also said that he supports that. And one individual who is likely to want to return to government in a ministerial capacity has also said that they think that that should be a priority for the new government. So I think we will get UK government sort of pulling its finger out, really, and making good on the commitments, because my prediction is that the new regime, whatever colour that is, will be more active at making good on its promises than the outgoing Boris Johnson regime. And obviously it's very, very early in any new government to be making predictions, but that would be the prediction I'm making, Lucia.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer, Jonathan. I just want to give a quick reminder to any audience members that they can put their questions in the Q&A module that should be highlighted on your console now. We've had some come in, but please feel free to add any questions you may have, and we'll get to as many of them as we can nearer the end of this discussion. So now back to you, Andre. What can you tell us about the EU's grand plans in its ESG and supply chain due diligence proposal? I know you said you were going to mention that, so over to you.
Yeah, grand plans indeed. And to prove to you that we're not UK-centric, this is something we consider to be very important because obviously we have clients and contacts throughout the world. And we know this is, as I say, going to be a big one. So yes, earlier this year, I think it was in February, the EU came out with a draft directive. So note, it's a directive. So that means, of course, EU member states will be implementing that into their national laws eventually and adding their own bits, as it were. And it came out with this directive, which is about increasing environmental, social and corporate governance, so ESG, and looking at supply chain due diligence requirements for businesses. And as I say, it's very big. It's about the environment as well. I'm not going to talk about that today. It covers human rights, within which you have modern slavery. But as I say, there are going to be other human rights that you'll have to think about as well. Now, if you did a word search in that EU proposal, you won't find the word whistleblowing, you won't find the word speaking up or raising concerns. But there is in that what's called a complaints procedure obligation, and I shall come on to that, which I think is very much about whistleblowing, but it's done in a particular sort of EU way. And there's also a very specific provision in there that refers to the EU whistleblowing legislation that, as you know, member states, I think most of them have implemented it by now. I hope so. By the end of December last year, that was when they had to do that. So that gets a specific mention as well. But I think there are, looking through it, as I say, it's a directive, so inevitably some of the language is going to be a little broad. I think there's plenty of other scope for other whistleblowing aspects, which is what I'm going to try and raise as I talk you through a little bit what this proposal is all about. Basically, what businesses have to do is they will have a duty where they will have what's called a corporate sustainability due diligence duty. And under that duty, what they have to do is do due diligence on their supply chains along with their own operations. As Jonathan emphasized, we've got, sadly, slavery in some of our businesses. It could be going on with the security guards or the cooking staff or whatever. So unfortunately that does occur. So it's looking inside your own business as well as the supply chains, and of course, and looking at your subsidiaries as well. And what you're supposed to do under this duty is identify both actual but also potential what are called adverse impacts of things to do with the environment or to do with human rights. And you have to identify if you've got an issue, and if you do have an issue, you've got to mitigate and so on. Or in worst case scenarios, if you're dealing with a supplier, as the directive says, you may actually have to terminate the relationship with that particular supplier. So it can be sort of quite drastic. Now, I should emphasize that this is for big organizations. And and I'll come onto the thresholds in a moment. But at the same time, don't think that if you're not within those thresholds, your organization won't be affected. Because remember, this is a supply chain due diligence piece of legislation. So you may be further down the supply chain, and so it may be that the obligations fall on your commercial partners, and they are then looking to you to implement, if you like, the practical effects of this legislation. So I think it will affect many, many organizations. As I say, it's for big guys, the big companies, both in the EU and outside the EU. If you're an EU company, that is a company, instituted under your national law in France, Germany, Luxembourg, Croatia, wherever, you have more than 500 employees and a net worldwide turnover of more than 150 million, you fall within the rules. Or if you have more than 250 employees and a net worldwide turnover of more than 40 million, provided that at least 50% of this turnover, sorry to be complex, is in certain sectors. This is the interesting thing about this legislation. It focuses in certain degrees on certain sectors. And it lists those. I'm not going to go through those, but there are a dozen of them: textiles, mineral resource extraction, chemicals, and so on. So that's for the EU companies. But as I said, if you're a non-EU company, this law also affects you. And don't think if you're outside the EU you can ignore it, because one of the sanctions in it is that you could find that your goods are prohibited from entering the EU if you don't follow this particular piece of legislation. So again, there are two thresholds here. If you've got a turnover of over 150 million in the EU, so you may be outside, but that's your turnover in the EU, or you've got a turnover of more than 40 million, but not more than 150 million euro, as long as 50% of that turnover was generated in one of those sectors that I mentioned. Sorry for this technical bit, but people, first question is always with these sorts of things is, do I fall in scope? So I kind of had to mention that a little bit. But as I do say, it is important to understand that it's not just for EU companies, it's for those outside, including obviously the UK. And as I say, don't think that you're not affected because you're not falling in that turnover. It's quite obvious, I think, when you start to think through this legislation, that if you're below that you're going to be affected, because the big guys are going to be sort of imposing things like contractual terms and things like that so that they can meet their obligations. So what sort of due diligence are we talking about? Well, it's very prescriptive, like always with EU legislation. It says this is what you have to do, but then it's a bit short on the detail. And this is where we think maybe the national legislation might start to flesh that out. As I say, you've got to integrate this due diligence into your policies. You've got to identify these adverse impacts. You've got to mitigate where there are problems. And you have to have this complaints procedure that I'll come on to in a moment. And you've got to monitor the effectiveness of your policies. So going back to what I said earlier about the UK with KPIs, you also have to do this according to this EU legislation. So in terms of, let's say, integrating this into your policies, what does that mean? Well, it could be talking about what your code of conduct does, and invariably in those codes of conduct we see whistleblowing measures and so on. So you've got to talk about those sorts of things. And because you have to identify these actual or potential adverse impacts, I think that too is where there may be a whistleblowing element. Because inevitably, if you're going to be saying to people, we've got to watch out for these things, the way you watch out for them is through having some kind of whistleblowing measures. And as I say, that will translate into practical things. So if people don't have hotlines, I think they will have to set up hotlines, or maybe even open up different hotlines specifically to cater with these particular issues. And as I said, one of the things you have to do, it's a clear obligation, it's Article 9 of this draft directive, is you have to set up this what they're calling a complaints procedure. Now, it struck me as slightly odd when I first read it, because it says that companies have to make it possible for both people and organizations to submit complaints where they have concerns about these adverse human rights or environmental issues. And so that to me immediately sounded like a sort of whistleblowing system that I recognized. But then when you look at who can do this, it lists three things. Firstly, people who have been affected or have reasonable grounds to believe they might be affected by an adverse impact. So that's a slightly unusual aspect, I think, because that's a little bit different to what we were talking about before about, let's say you're on a construction site and you spot something where you think, oh, these people who are working over there, there's something funny going on. They arrived in a van. They weren't allowed to talk to anybody, that kind of stuff. So it doesn't seem to be that kind of area. But again, we'll have to see how member states implement this. They might want to put more details in there about that. And then it can be also trade unions or workers' representatives in the value chain, as they call it in the legislation, who can bring these complaints. So again, that's the thing to think about, which we haven't touched on yet, but which we might say a bit more about, is you do get activist groups very much involved in modern slavery issues as well. We have seen, and we might talk about this later, there's some cases about this going before courts. And you can even get civil society organizations, they're specifically listed, who can bring these complaints. And if you read what you have to do about the complaints procedure, there has to be a follow-up. People have the right to have meetings and so on. Some of it sounds a little bit like the EU Whistleblowing Directive, but in a slightly sort of different way. There are other things in there. I shall probably move on a little bit that you can do. But I should also mention that there are going to be special dedicated regulators in the EU that deal with this area. So this is going to be something very new. I mean, in the UK, as I mentioned before, we tried to introduce, some members of Parliament tried to introduce private legislation to bring in what was called a whistleblowing czar, someone who's a dedicated individual who deals with whistleblowing issues. It seems to me what the EU legislation is doing is it's setting up an actual regulator who will deal with all these issues where you may have a complaint and so on, that you may be able to go to eventually. As I say, we're going to have to see how this is fleshed out in detail by the member states. And there will inevitably be penalties for people who fail to meet the legislation. And as I said, there is even a very specific provision in there that caters for the EU Whistleblowing Directive that I was talking about before, that you're probably all very familiar with, because you may remember in that piece of the legislation, it listed about a dozen areas of law, environmental law, antitrust, and so on. Well, now what will be added into that list is this particular directive. So you'll be able to sort of whistleblow about people not doing things, which could include whistleblowing, as it were. I'm talking very broadly here. But as I say, that's what it caters for. And companies will be liable. There's civil liability in that, this draft directive, if you fail to, prevent these potential adverse impacts and so on. So it could be that, let's say, something has gone wrong with your whistleblowing system. That could be something where you could end up being liable under these rules for, as I say, failing to do something properly. And almost last but not entirely least, the bit that really makes people sit up when I talk about this legislation is there are very specific provisions for directors. Now, under our UK compliance statement, a director has to sign off on that. And we have, in our dealings with organisations, sometimes had a few issues with that because the directors are not always very keen to sign up. Well, here under these draft EU rules, directors have got clear responsibilities where they have to get involved in a number of the things that I mentioned to you about the due diligence that has to be done. They have a clear role to play, and I'm guessing they could be the ones who could be in trouble if something goes wrong. So they're going to have a lot to deal with, directors, under this directive if it's adopted the way it will go. So just to end this piece about the sort of EU proposals, as it came out this year, it'll probably take about 2 years to go through the EU legislative pipeline. Then there'll be a short period before it gets published, and then EU member states will have 2 years to implement it. So we are looking at some way down the line until it comes fully into force. And like with all EU measures, there will no doubt be some changes to it, but it is a tall order. And you may be thinking 5 years is a long time away, but do start thinking about putting in resources and thinking about things now, like your whistleblowing hotlines may sort of factor in with this, because I do, as I say, it is going to be a big one, and one that we're all going to be talking about over the next couple of years, as I say, as it goes through that EU legislative pipeline. Lucia.
Perfect. Thank you, Andre. And we've had a few questions through from the audience on this piece, which we'll address later in the webinar. But now just moving on to something else we said we would explore during this webinar. So Jonathan, what does greenwashing mean, and why should I care, or anyone care about the greenwashing aspect?
Yes, thanks, Lucia. And just as an update, the news chopper is hovering, so I suspect the Prime Minister's announcement is imminent. I think the organisations have obviously made moves to do good in the last few years, maybe more than ever, with their ESG agendas, with their move towards green technology, which in part is to fit in with their ESG agendas, and in part because of the rising cost of conventional fuel. But that doesn't come without its challenges. And I think the challenges that many compliance professionals are facing at the moment are these claims that bits of the business are making about being kinder to the planet, and how that fits in with modern slavery, and how that fits in with ESG policies, and also how that matches existing law like fair trading law, like Advertising Standards Authority obligations if you're a UK business, competitive advertising rules in places like Germany or the Netherlands. And that, I think, is definitely an emerging area of risk for businesses. So the starting point, I think, is that not all green energy is good. And many organisations have made claims that the switch to green is kinder to the planet. And the risks there, if you look at, if we take, for example, solar, wind and battery, if you look at solar, for example, 95% of solar modules rely on one primary material, solar-grade polysilicon. Polysilicon manufacturers in Zhuhai, the Xinjiang autonomous region, which is the focus of the main concern, account for 45% of the world's supply of that material. Much of the assembly of solar panels takes place in Zhuhai, and allegedly the four major suppliers in that solar panel chain have participated in labour transfer programs from the Zhuhai administration. So solar comes with risks. And to answer one of the questions that we've had already, of course, for many organisations, you do need to sort out your own modern slavery stance, but you also need to push that down to suppliers as well. There's an example of that if we look at wind power. Wind power has a similar exposure to Xinjiang. For example, ActionAid have produced studies in 2018 about the, if you like, the bad side of wind power. In 2021, a major household name technology business had struggles that are perhaps illustrative of the issue. They had said, we are going to carbon neutrality. They'd made a big statement about it. We're kinder to the planet. You can rely on us to do the right thing. And yet it seems that the wind turbines they procured through suppliers as part of that program were the result of forced labor from the Uyghur communities. And the criticism extended not just to the organization, but they were also, if you like, guilty by association. Some of the supply routes were fairly tenuous. So in one case, they procured goods, a US multinational procured goods through an Irish subsidiary, and then there were a number of subcontractors involved. And it was alleged that one of those subcontractors was purchasing from a sanctioned organization. And obviously, not only do regulators get interested in that, there's potential reporting obligations for a US corporation. And there was also a very uncomfortable dialogue with employees of that organization who perhaps felt that they couldn't raise issues internally and went external instead. So obviously the hallmark of a good whistleblowing program isn't that you don't get no complaints at all, is that you sometimes head off complaints internally, which would otherwise be external. And if we look at battery, the sort of third replacement technology that a lot of people are looking at. I know people are looking at reusing old car batteries, et cetera, for big battery plants. Then again, that's not without its issues. 60% of the world's cobalt, essential component of those batteries, is mined in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and children of 7 years of age apparently work 12-hour days to produce those batteries. So the critical thing here, I think, is to make sure that you can back up any claims you make. Advertising law, comparative advertising law, effectively says that claims must be honest, lawful, decent, and you must be able to back up what you say with facts. I think we haven't had enough legal Latin on this webinar, and I know some of you are big fans of it. The Latin legal maxim is "E incumbit probatio qui dicit non qui negat." The burden of proof is on the organization who makes the claim to be able to back it up. And we know that in many cases that's been problematical. There's a case in Hong Kong, for example, where an organization says that moving to Tesla vehicles is kinder to the planet. But on Hong Kong, the electricity to power the Tesla vehicles is coming from carbon fuels. So as compliance professionals, if you're involved in this area, there's a number of tasks. First of all, you need to be the critical friend to the business on these ESG claims. Can we really back up what we're saying with hard facts that we can produce to a regulator, produce to the media, produce to the court of public opinion, produce to our employees, that will reassure them that we have thought about these issues and all of our suppliers have too. And if we can't really make those claims. And then secondly, does our whistleblowing program stand up to scrutiny? Are we sure that any of our employees or any of our suppliers' employees can raise concerns with us internally for us to act on rather than have an external agency look at those first and catch us by surprise? So a critical area, and one that's interlinked with the ESG agenda that many organizations are rightly pushing.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer, Jonathan. That was great. Andrea, I'll hand over to you with one last question before we move to the audience Q&A, where we've had some questions come through. So lastly, before we move on to that, if I'm going to blow the whistle on modern slavery, what are the signs that I would need to look out for?
Yes, thanks. And I think this follows on from Jonathan's practical points in terms of having a program. One of the things you need to do is to train people, and you need to train them to spot the signs of modern slavery. And in our experience, this isn't rocket science. You can take people through a number of short points about things that they need to look out for, and if they have concerns, that they then, as I say, need to report those. Now, of course, some of the things they report might not turn out to be instances of modern slavery, but better to be safe than sorry. And I have a sort of list I'm just going to go through, a kind of top dozen things, but it's not an exhaustive list, of the sorts of things you can look out for, those sorts of signs of things that make you think something is wrong here, and I want to raise concerns, I want to speak up about. One thing that's a clear one is maybe you're talking to someone and you think they're speaking in a very strange way. It sounds like they've been instructed or coached to say certain things. So you're asking them questions and it sounds like they're recounting a script to you, and it doesn't sound quite right. And sort of connected with that is someone tells their story and it's obviously riddled with errors. There are things that obviously just don't seem right when they're talking to you about their sort of situations. And sometimes another third point is that we also find that those people aren't actually allowed to speak for themselves. There's someone there, a kind of shadowy figure, if you like, who is the person who's doing all the speaking for that individual. And then there are other sort of classic ones. Let's say if you're doing an audit or you're going on to, let's say, and I'm not pointing the finger at the construction business necessarily, but we've seen this happen there, where there are people who are on the site, and you ask them, what sort of papers do you have? But it seems that they have no ID papers. Maybe their passports have been taken and so on, or their travel documents they don't seem to have them. That's a sort of sign that somebody may have been trafficked, for example, and is being used for human slavery purposes. Another thing we've seen is that you get these sort of gangs where they take people to a site, and they have their own transport, and they take the people, and the people come out of the vehicle and they don't speak to anybody, and then they all get back into the vehicle at the end of the day in a sort of seemingly non-voluntary manner. Also, people who, getting back to my other theme about when you're talking to somebody, sometimes they appear withdrawn, frightened, or have got physical indicators, even certain types of tattoos. That's well known for some African countries, for example, where people have been tattooed in certain ways. It sounds like a terrible thing to say. It sounds like a sort of medieval thing to say, but unfortunately it does still happen. And it may be that if you're talking to someone, asking them questions, ask them about their family, their contacts, and it seems they don't really have any free contact with those people. So you get some of those social signs. Even things like people's clothing maybe look strange for their working environment. You think, why are they wearing that? That looks a bit odd for the job that they're doing. And then if you get deeper down into details, you might not get this far, but if you're talking to somebody, it seems that they have no control over their finances, don't have a bank account, and so on. And then the other sort of final classic one, people are in terrible accommodation that's provided by their workplace. They're like in a dormitory where there's sort of one tap, one toilet, and so on. Now, these things are not necessarily mean that modern slavery is going on. They are indicators. But as I say, you will probably, because we're all adept and competent at this, you'll have a gut feel that something isn't right. And that's when you'll want to say, call that hotline and say, look, I've seen something today, didn't seem right to me. I think it should be looked into. As I say, it may be that there's nothing wrong, but better safe than sorry. And there are even, as Jonathan mentioned, you can go public. It's best to deal with this obviously internally if you can. But there are also some well-known public phone numbers you can call if you're really concerned. And do be careful, of course, because like the police always say, don't try and tackle these things personally, because many of these people who've been trafficked, this has been done by criminal gangs who are not the nicest of people, if I can put it that way. So, don't try this at home, as I say. But this is where the whistleblowing function is so important, because, if you report internally, then, you'll have a team of people who will be able to deal with the issue. As I say, it may be that there's a non-issue in the end, but better safe than sorry. Richard.
Can I just add to that, Andre? I mean,
sorry, Jonathan, you go.
I was just going to say that don't tackle these gangs yourself is definitely wise words. I understand that one police force now has the fire brigade in attendance, and not just so that they can open the premises quickly, but so I was told that firemen are generally, physically fit. And if there's going to be a fist fight, the police would like the fire brigade there as well. And joking aside, a lot of these gangs are, serious organized crime and with a history of real violence. And we can just look at the criminal cases that we've seen in the UK that would illustrate that.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you both for the answers to those questions. So I'd like to now turn to the audience Q&A. We've had a few questions through and we've left a sufficient amount of time to try and get through as many as we can, and we will try and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to start with the first one that came through, which is what body would be responsible for enforcing any new Modern Slavery Act requirements? I don't know which one of you want to take that on to begin with.
I can try that. If you mean in the UK context, currently it's the Home Office that deals with these issues. They're not really a regulator as such, but we'll have to see under the new changes, and we don't know the details of these yet, whether something more comes out of that. From what I've understood, though, I don't think we're going to get a specific regulator as such. I think it'll probably still be with the Home Office to enforce, so that if, as I said, I think the basic thing that will get passed, that will make it, if the whole bill goes through, is that these 6 areas that are currently voluntary to report on become mandatory. That it could be then that someone complains to the Home Office and says, well, I've seen in this modern slavery statement that there's something I think is wrong, or even that someone hasn't published a statement or whatever, and that they go to the Home Office, and then it will be the Home Office that would write to that company first, before taking any sort of action or any sort of investigation. I suspect that's the way it's going to work out, but I don't think we're going to get individual regulator in the UK, unlike under the EU proposals, as I say, that is proposing this a special regulator.
Just to add a couple of things, Andre. One's a question for you. The first, a statement. There are, of course, criminal provisions under the legislation as well. Some organisations could breach the criminal provisions. It's important to know that they exist, and your helpline, on a worst case scenario, may have to deal with those, and they're enforced by the police. And there was originally hopes for an independent commissioner, sort of like the Information Commissioner, but without the same powers. And it's fair to say, I think, isn't it, that the first commissioner was somewhat critical of the government and the fact that he felt that he was toothless versus other similar regulators. I think that's the case, isn't it, Andre?
Yes, and we still have that that individual independent figure, the sort of modern slavery commissioner. But I don't think there's a proposal to make them a sort of regulator as such. But I think they would very much welcome it if there were more teeth added, and whether they got some extra powers. In some of those private members' bills that I mentioned that UK parliamentarians introduced, they did want to give more power to the commissioner, if I remember rightly, to be able to act, particularly if, as I say, people had deficient statements and so on.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. And then, Andre, I believe this was a question put in whilst you were discussing the EU side of things. And this question was, so does what you mentioned count or apply to a particular company size across whole groups, or is it just each individual entity? So does this count of company size apply across all groups or just each individual entity?
Yeah, that I'm not sure. It's sort of phrased fairly broadly. I think I'd have to look into something like the recitals to see if there's anything there more specific as to whether it's the individual organisation or the group. I mean, we've had this issue before with other EU legislation, so I can't really give a firm answer to that one. But that's something I'll look into. My reading of it mainly, I think, is that it's individual groups, but I can't be entirely sure. Individual organisations, sorry, but I can't be entirely sure.
No worries at all, but thank you for answering that. There's a couple of ones. They're quite long questions, so just bear with me. But one of them is that large organizations will have already been reporting annually on ESG and have detailed whistleblowing frameworks in place. Incorporating awareness of whistleblowing processes to suppliers and building the due diligence into third-party contracts does get done currently. how far into the supply chain is there an expectation of due diligence? Some companies utilize multiple subcontractors who are subject to separate contracts that firms are not legally entitled to request / scrutinize. So I don't know who would like to answer that question.
Well, I can kick off. I mean, this is the eternal issue, isn't it? You get we've seen this with people under the UK Act, where they say, how far do we have to go down the supply chain? And it's always a tricky one. I mean, in theory, I think the UK, and I'm guessing at the EU level, they want you to go all the way, but of course, practically in many cases, it's just not possible. So it is a tricky one. Jonathan, sorry, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say there's perhaps an analogy with the Serious Fraud Office policy on bribery, where they're more or less saying that you're responsible for the tier below you and for making sure that the tier below you has proper processes in place. So perhaps as far as the proposed hardcore legislation, if you like, that may be something, in my view, that governments might look at, but that'd be a personal opinion. But then I think that changes when you make claims, and we've seen that with the example that I gave from June last year, that if you are saying we are kinder to the planet, then that's an absolute. You're not saying we are kinder to the planet, save beyond the first level of our procurement program, and then we don't take any measurable steps after that. You know, that would be not a statement that marketing would want to sign off, wouldn't it? So I think, again, we have to be careful about the claims that we're making, and particularly in the area of greenwashing ESG claims, where we might be confident that we're doing all that we can, but if we can't get that visibility further down the supply chain, then I think for many organizations, they can't safely make the claims that they are making.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer from you both. Another slightly lengthy question. So someone from the audience has put in here that in their experience, verification, in brackets audit, is the biggest issue with respect to the supply chain modern slavery standards. Companies crank out their statements and state their great program initiatives and the controls they have, i.e. contract clauses, but very little is being done in the way of audit to verify the supplier's compliance. You have to go look at the supplier's controls up, i.e. if they have live on site and who is really being paid. In their opinion, companies are doing this verification part badly or hardly at all. What would your thoughts be on this topic?
Yeah, no, that reflects very much what I've been hearing from people, that they find some real challenges, particularly during COVID. Of course, people couldn't go out and inspect places either. So I suspect a lot got swept under the carpet there. But certainly I know we've met people who've had real challenges in doing these audits when they go out, that things are being hidden from them and so on. So even when they actually get out to do them, there are challenges. But you're absolutely right. This is, I think, a real sort of Achilles heel in the whole process. Jonathan, sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I know we've tried to help clients look at people to do on the ground audits in Xinjiang, for example, and don't underestimate the difficulty there. Many of your first choice audit firms won't touch Xinjiang. They feel that some of their people on the ground would have personal safety issues if they were to speak uncritically about the authorities there, and they don't want people to go in and speak and not speak the truth, because that harms their global reputation. So many of your first choice audit firms will not go there. And of course, the audit problem isn't just in China, it's in many other countries as well, where it's hard to move freely, even in good times. And as Andre has alluded to, in bad times it's worse. We know, for example, in the fashion garment industry, the problems of Rana Plaza, for example, of suppliers switching and you're not truly knowing the nature of the supplier. One fashion retailer I looked at recently said, oh yeah, we don't source from Chinese suppliers. That's our only way of behaving. We're going to be transparent about the suppliers we use. I just happened to look at the suppliers that they'd published for Italy, and the first 10 names on the list of their Italian suppliers were all Chinese names. So some of the suppliers obviously reflag and pretend to be in locations that they're not. And it's wrong to be xenophobic about this. The Bayes Committee found that the same issues with not being able to audit existed in Leicester in the UK. So this isn't just a problem abroad. There is a real problem of doing on-site audits in the UK as well, particularly if you're buying from suppliers who are deceitful. So what do we do? Well, the answer isn't just because we haven't got the perfect solution, let's not try. I think you have to make a reasonable effort and reasonable endeavours, and that is going to have to include things like making sure that your suppliers know your helpline number so that their employees can call you if they've not got concerns. It is going to include training your people, whether they're your people or third parties you use, in the signs of slavery that Andre's discussed. And it has to include, non-expected audits. There's no point in doing an audit if you give the organization 4 weeks notice and give them a date and time that you're going to attend. If you're going to properly monitor your supply chain, you're going to have to be able to do the equivalent of a dawn raid and go to, if somebody's manufacturing for you, you're going to have to go and knock on the door occasionally and check that the goods that are meant to be manufactured in X location are actually there when you visit.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, but the answer may have to be shortened. So the last question that I'd like to ask you both is, do you have any updates on global modern slavery legislation coming into effect? This person understands that recent acts were implemented in Norway and Holland.
Yeah, that's right. And there's the famous German Supply Chain Act as well. That's a really big one. In Holland, I think it's to do with child slave labour. Remember, in France, we had something a few years ago. But yes, there are definitely more happening in the Baltics and the Nordics that I'm aware of. So yes, there are quite a few others coming in. Jonathan, I don't know if you're aware of any others I might have missed on the list. No? Are you frozen or are you on mute, Jonathan? I'm not sure.
I think you potentially may have frozen.
Okay, all right. Well, I think that's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, Canada. Canada's one place. Sorry, Canada is one place they've been trying a few years to introduce something on, and I think don't know how far they've got down the line there, but that could be an important one as well.
Jonathan, I don't know if you're back, and I don't know if you wanted to add any more,
Yes.
but I think you froze for a second there.
Yeah, I did freeze. Sorry for that. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe Boris is pulling the plug on my internet now. But I just said, and Andre might have said it anyway, Australia, California obviously has had long-standing legislation. Many of the US states, I think, are looking at it. And then US federal regime is obviously, as we alluded to, using importation laws, which can have a real effect on people's ability to trade.
Yeah, I should add to that, something I missed on the EU side is last year the EU announced it would have an import ban on slave-made products. We still haven't seen that piece of legislation come in. Don't know whether it'll be a separate law or something added to a customs law, but that could be a big one as well. And that in itself opens up a whole can of worms, because how do you identify a product? particularly if it's like a commodity or something like that. We've seen this issue obviously with cotton and Xinjiang. It can be a real tough issue. So yes, you're right to point that out, Jonathan. There are other laws that are bringing that in, and then there's that strange law we have in the UK on prison-made goods from the 19th century that people have talked about, maybe in that particular area. I think we're bang on 12, aren't we?
Yes, so unfortunately we have run out of time on the Q&A portion. We will try and get round to your questions separately to this session.
Lucia, sorry, over to you.
But I just want to say thank you to both Andre and Jonathan for your answers and the detailed descriptions of all the points that this webinar explored. It was great. Also want to thank the audience for participating in this. And we always appreciate feedback because we want to make these webinars and events as valuable to you as possible. So on your console now, you'll see a survey that will literally take about 20 seconds to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. Also, in the resource list that you'll see on your console, there's some articles from Caudry Compliance surrounding this topic, as well as some whistleblowing topics that aren't directly related to this, but whistleblowing as a whole that you will see. Again, just want to thank you both for joining today's session and the audience members, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.